Welcome everyone. My name is Christina Anderson. I'm work for Wisconsin Land and Water. I'm the training and outreach specialist here in Madison. And we are here to talk about waterway permitting for the Chapter 30 with Marty Griffin from DNR. I'll let him introduce himself as well in just a minute. Just a couple more, just a reminder about the go-to meeting. I can make sure everyone's muted. If you have any questions, we'll be holding them till the end. Just type your questions in the chat and use the little arrows at the very top of the GoToMeeting bar to hide that screen. It'll go up to the top. So with that, again, welcome. This webinar is really meant to kind of start the discussion about Chapter 30's permitting. Today we'll talk about waterways, and on July 23rd we'll do it at the same time again, 9 o'clock. There's a second link on the website, and I'll send it back out to the LCD listserv. And that will focus a little bit more about wetlands. And we hope this is really the start of a discussion about permitting, Chapter 30 permitting, waterways, wetlands, and we hope to have some winter workshops regionally around the state that will bring together agency partners and stakeholders involved in these permitting decisions together to continue discussions. So again, with that, I'm going to pass this over to Marty Griffin from the DNR to start our presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Christina. So, my name's Marty Griffin. I'm with the Wisconsin DNR, and my role in the Waterway and Wetland Protection Program is a statewide policy coordinator. So I work a lot with all of the water management specialists who are the actual permit writers and reviewers, along with our resource experts out in the field. So I'm sort of like the central office coordinator for all those folks, and so help them through, controversial permitting issues, or permitting issues that may not be black and white, or permitting issues that need a little bit of extra attention, and work through our policies that we incorporate to help interpret basically Chapter 30, the public trust doctrine, and the way we regulate our public waters in the state. So we'll go right into this presentation I've created, and so I'll just give a quick overview before I get into it, since we're holding questions till the end. I'm going to give a little bit of history of the public trust doctrine, sort of where it came from, how the state actually got its authority to regulate public waters, and then sort of talk about how we figure out what actually is under our authority, our actual jurisdiction. So we'll get into detail about that. Then we'll move into if a project actually is under the jurisdiction of the state because it impacts public water, how to navigate the permit process. So when do you actually need a permit? Are there things you can do where you don't need a permit? And if you do need a permit, how you go about doing that, and the types of permits that are available, and also different ways you can do projects. So that's a view of what I'm going to talk about today. There'll be a lot of web addresses thrown up because we have a lot of our information online now. So feel free to jot those down. Obviously we're recording this, so if you miss anything, you can go back and look at it. And so with that, we'll get right into it. So what we're talking about, when I mentioned before the state's jurisdiction over public waters, really that stems from what we call the public trust doctrine. And what the public trust doctrine really is, it's a constitutional responsibility. It's not something that the governor bestowed upon the, it's not something that the courts gave. It's actually in the state constitution, which governs all branches of government. And if you're ever interested in looking up what the actual language is in the Constitution that gives the state public trust responsibility, it's Article 9, Section 1, and you can look that up, and you can really see the language that is in the Constitution that sort of governs our program, our regulatory program. And so that constitutional responsibility really was to protect navigable water. And that's sort of a theme you're going to hear throughout this presentation, the word navigable, because that really hinges upon state's jurisdiction relies. And that's because it's in the Constitution. The Constitution says navigable. So a little bit of history of how we even got Article 9, Section 1 put in the Constitution. You can think way back, you know, around the time the National Constitution of the United States was actually written and signed. So this is, you know, after we became independent in 1776, and we had the original 13 colonies, but there was also this area, you know, to the west of the colonies that still haven't been developed in the states yet, which we call the Northwest Territory, and that's basically what is the upper Midwest today. And so this green map here kind of shows the states, but this is sort of the region, this Great Lakes region, which was called the Northwest Territory. And so the cool thing about the Northwest Territory was before there was even a constitution at the national level, we had this thing called the Northwest Ordinance. And if you know about anything about the Northwest Ordinance, it gave a lot of cool things like freedom of religion, you know, right to a jury trial, you know, there was no slavery, things like that. And that's eerily familiar to actually what the National Constitution of the United States says. And so if anyone here is a historian buff or you like the history of the United States and Constitution or anything like that, you'll learn that the writers of the Constitution actually borrowed some of these things and these ideas from the Northwest Ordinance. So it's kind of cool to think about the area we live in that was governed by this Northwest Ordinance, sort of was ahead of its time, and you know that theme does definitely carry over in Wisconsin's history. So in this Northwest Ordinance, in addition to freedom of religion and things like that, there was a quote that talked about navigable waters, and I have the quote here on the screen. It says, "Navigable waters leading into the Mississippi and St. Lawrence, obviously the rivers, and the carrying places in between the same shall be common highways and forever free." So, you know, way back before we were even a state, they were thinking about how the water in the state that was very important are something that everyone should be able to use, common, and obviously common highways, they're referring to the use of the highways for commerce and transporting goods and services, but they're forever free. You know, nobody can own them. You know, they're for everyone to use. And so this idea was, you know, way back in 7. And so over time, there's been legal and legislative action to clarify, you know, what that actually means, that common highways forever free, because those are, you know, nice free-flowing words that are, you know, in these in the Northwest Ordinance, but exactly what that means, and sometimes it's hard to interpret. So over time, you know, there's been court cases, there have been legal actions. Obviously, when you action statutes that have come into effect, and so they sort of clarify or interpret, you know, what that Article 9 section basically was exactly the language taken from the Northwest Ordinance, what that actually means, and actually jurisdiction is over public waters. So if you go back and you look at all the court cases and you look at the state statutes and how they've changed over time, you'll see that when they've interpreted common highways forever free to basically public interest in these navigable waters, because remember the Constitution uses the word navigable water. So, you know, what is the public interest in navigable waters? Well, when you look at all the court decisions and what the statutes actually say, it's basically the public rights to navigation, fish and wildlife habitat, water quality and quantity. So that's how good your water is, and actually having enough water, recreational activities, and natural scenic beauty. So all these sort of concepts are wrapped up in the public interest and the public trust in these public waters. And so before, when I mentioned it's the state's responsibility, well, it's the responsibility of the state to look at these factors when looking at changes to public waters. And so the primary way we do that is, as a state, is permitting requirements. And so that's how we ensure that the public rights and interests are protected. And so that's our constitutional responsibility, and the way we implement that responsibility is through a permitting program. So the permitting program, we talked about the legislative actions. Well, they've created Chapter 30 of Wisconsin statute, so the common term everyone talks about is a Chapter 30 permit or Chapter 30 this or that. And so just to make sure everyone's on the same page, Chapter 30 is actually the chapter in the statutes that governs this permitting program to help us protect the public interests in public waters. Some of the important cases that we talked about, the judicial branch and the law aspect, in addition to the state statutes of Chapter 30, there's been a few landmark cases, and some of you may recognize some of these names. The DeGainer case in 1975 was a really big public trust case, and so this is just meant to illustrate that, you know, that interpretation of common highways and forever free, and then even after it was put into the state's constitution, the word navigable waters and what that means has always been something debated, expanded upon, changed, modified. And so, you know, since 1871 all the way up through 1987, even today in the 2000s, that are, you know, constantly trying to interpret what it means for the state's jurisdiction under the public trust doctrine. So let's get into a little bit of the detail here of what those court cases that I just illustrated from the 1800s all the way to now, and what the intersection between the law and the actual state statutes and what it actually means to be navigable. So the state statutes, and we talked about Chapter 30, so you'll see many references here that have a 30 dot number, 30.10, which is what's on the screen now. There's some other statutory references. So Chapter 30, that's the 30 part, and then the section is the number you see. So in 30 point or dot 10, you know, that's the exact part of the statute that talks about what a navigable waterway is and what a public waterway is. It essentially talks about the state's jurisdiction being navigable waters, and the courts, through especially that DeGainer case that I referenced before, have further interpreted to mean an area of water, navigable water, similar where you can obviously float a watercraft. And they expanded upon that in a couple other court cases that says it can be the lightest recreational watercraft. So that's a pretty strong descriptor, recreational watercraft, and then the lightest recreational watercraft. And so you can think about when some of those court cases, I think this one came in 1975 or late 70s, early 80s, you know, did they fathom the types of recreational watercraft that are super light that we have in 2015? I mean, you can get some pretty cool Kevlar small things. So were they meant to say any water body that you could float something like that on? So, you know, that's some of the questions that we program, and especially why there's that legal component that's always balancing that legislative component when it comes to the program. They further expanded upon it and said, okay, well, it has to be the lightest recreational watercraft that's commonly used. So you can't go and find the Olympic kayaker specialty equipment to sort of get this. It's got to be something that commonly can be, you know, obviously used by normal everyday people and recreational purposes. Something you can get at Cabela's, for instance. And of course, you have to be able to do this. You have to be able to float the lightest recreational watercraft that's in common use on a reoccurring basis. They obviously put this in here through these court cases because it wasn't meant to say that, you know, any float a boat, for instance, could be considered a navigable water. Obviously, if anyone was around in the floods we had, I think it was, you know, 2005 or so, 5 years ago, or 10 years ago now, you know, you could float a canoe down some streets in some areas, and so obviously they wouldn't say that that would be something the state's public trust responsibility extends to. So you have to be able to float the lightest watercraft that's in common use on a reoccurring basis. So that's one part of the navigability test. But there's a second test, and that is that this area where you can float your lightest watercraft on a recurring basis has to have what we call the bed and banks. So it has to have some type of defined channel, something where it has two parts to it, the bed and the banks. And they have to be defined. They can't just be something that holds water like a grass swale or some type of grass water course. For instance, it has to be defined bed and banks, which means that the bed material has to be different than the bank material. The bank has to appear, act, and look different than the bed. They have to be two separate defined entities. So let's go into some picture examples of what we're talking about when we're looking at what the bed and banks mean. You can see in this particular photo, the bed material is very different than the bank material. The bed is made up of rocks, cobble, stones, and obviously on the bank you have vegetation, and if you were to peel back that vegetation, you'd probably not see such a rocky area, but more soils and things like that. So this is a pretty simple description of a defined bed and bank. You have two different parts to the navigable waterway. Here's another example, more woody debris, more silty, sandy bed material, and then obviously on the banks you have even different type of vegetation growing. So remember, it wasn't just the bed and banks. I mean, that can be clearly seen on those photos, but you still have to be able to float this watercraft, right? So sometimes when you want to float a watercraft, you have debris or logs or things in the way. And so if I stick my kayak, if you look at this photo here, right in between those two downed trees, I probably wouldn't be able to move very far. Is that considered navigation? Is that considered something that falls into the public interest test? Well, remember, the court cases didn't say you had to really, navigate or move from point A to point B. It basically says, is there a defined bed and banks that holds water that's enough for you to actually float your watercraft? So if you can float your watercraft, you're good to go, because the courts realize that in some systems there are obstructions, especially in more natural systems. And so as long as you're able to portage or move your watercraft around these obstructions and continue on navigating down, there's enough water to float, you could be able to do that. So remember, the thing is about floating, not necessarily taking a straight, direct path down the watercourse. Obviously, there's other systems that may not have obstructions, but they get very narrow or small at times. They have tight bends and things, and that may be impeding a straight path or getting from point A to point B. But again, the courts have realized that and basically said, turns that are tight, that's okay, because really we're talking about floating. And so you may have to, pull your way around or get out in portage, but you can still continue down the watercourse because you're able to float your watercraft from point A to point B. So now that you guys are all experts on navigability, I gave you the bed and banks, some examples, some things to look at when you're trying to determine if you could float a watercraft. Let's look at a few examples and see. I know we can't obviously have a verbal back and forth here, but sort of in your head when you look at some of these pictures, kind of think what you would say if you thought this would be a navigable waterway, a public waterway, and therefore covered under the state's public trust responsibility. So obviously, I threw up a pretty easy one first. Hopefully when you saw this, you said, okay, I see some different change in vegetation, so maybe way up in the In the background, I see maybe a little tiny channel, or maybe even in the foreground, I see a little bit of a push down vegetation and some shadowing, like maybe there's some type of water course here. But obviously, when you look at this, you know, there's no defined bed and bank. There's no difference, even if water does travel down this slope here, which it probably does in high rain or runoff events. It's not done so in such a long period of time or been defined to even have any defined bed and bank. So hopefully that's what you were thinking when you saw that photo. All right, so this one looks like you have a little defined bed and bank. I see some cobble, some rock, and then some more vegetation. You can even see maybe in the foreground on the right side of the picture, there's even a little bit of a lip there. So looks like water definitely comes through here. You can see a little bit of a water course, but it's completely dry right now. It's really hard to tell. Can you float a watercraft on a recurring basis here right now, looking at this picture? I mean, obviously, the answer is I don't know. You can't tell. So sometimes we have watercourses that look like this, and we have to make sure that, well, obviously, at this point in time today, it doesn't meet the navigability test. But what if every spring, between the months of April and May, I could float a watercraft down here, and it's just in the low water for the month of April that it looks like this. So that could be definitely a water body we would take jurisdiction over for public trust responsibility, because it does meet the navigability test on a recurring basis. It just might not be having flowing water every single day, every single day of the year. So save the best one for last. Obviously, this is one of the no-brainer photos, or hopefully you thought that when you saw it. You know, clearly we have defined bed and banks here. Yes, there's some sloughing of the bank. But you can see the material in the bottom of the channel there is definitely different than the bank material. And you can even see a change in vegetation. You can see much vegetation. There's definitely a water course there. It's low water. Can you float a watercraft on a recurring basis here? Well, there's more information in this photo that I didn't completely give you, but this is the low water, and you still see a little bit of flowing water in this particular point. Maybe I could float something, maybe I couldn't, but I definitely know that in earlier other parts of the season I'd be flying through here on my kayak. So this would be definitely meet the test of navigability and be under state's public trust responsibility. So don't worry if you didn't get 3 out of 3 there on that pseudo navigability determination, because we're not expecting everybody out there to be navigability experts. That's something that the state as a service can provide to you and help you out with. That's part of our role, because that's part of our responsibility. But we have been working to get a lot of the information that we do when we go out on site and make these determinations available to you. And we do have some maps available. They're not fully, populated with all the data we have, but there is a lot of data in there. We have a mapping service called the Surface Water Data Viewer. Some of you may use or be familiar with. If you're not, the easiest way to get there is just Google SWDV. It comes up, the first one, every single time. We must have paid the Google God something or did something right, because it really does work. So that's a way you can get to our mapping system. And the way we created these maps was because of court cases and the way our data was showing us. We used the 24K USGS topo maps, which have been available since the beginning of time. And any perennial or intermittent stream already basically was presumed to be navigable. And then any of those particular water bodies that we actually did a site visit for, sort of got the extra stamp. So we use that as our base. And if anyone's interested in, obviously obtaining those or having those on file because they're great maps to have, especially if you are trying to determine if a water body may fall under public trust jurisdiction. I have the website here. So if you go into our surface water data viewer, and some of you may be familiar with it, these are just screenshots from it. It looks like any other basic GIS mapping tool. A lot of them are looking the same now in the way of the tools and the language they use for how you navigate around. So, you know, you get to our opening screen with the base layer of the state of Wisconsin. And as you can see, the toolbar at the top shows all the tools and layers. And so when you actually open the layers to get your listing of layers, there'll be tons and tons of layers because we have a lot of data in this mapping system. But the one you're looking for is called permits and related data. And so it's probably about, you know, halfway down or the top third of the list. If you open up that permits and related data, you will see a bunch of subcategories, and the one you're looking for is called navigability determinations. And so once you click that sublayer on, you'll see water bodies on the map that were once blue will change to either a green or a red. And you can see here that's what's happening in this screenshot. So if it's green, that means that we were on site, and so we made a determination on that. If it's red, that basically means that, and we determine it to be non-navigable. If it's blue, that means it's obviously on the 24K USGS topo layer, so it's more than likely going to be navigable, but it means we have not been on site to verify that. Now, I will say at this point that I do know a lot of people out there in the audience are affiliated with county governments, and sometimes to help us out, you guys do some of your own navigability or have done some navigability determinations that we sort of concur with and help out with. So I'm sure there's a bunch of data out there, and so this is just a call for some of that data. You can feel free to contact me, and you'll have my information if you have data out there that we can actually use to make this mapping service even better for people to use. So we went through the history. We went through the bed and banks and the floating the boat, determine if we have jurisdiction. We went through our cool mapping service of some of the places we already did that for you already. And so if you see a green line on those maps, you know, does that mean I need a permit? Because I kept saying, right, if you meet that navigability test, you fall under the public trust responsibility of the state, and that's 100% accurate. But we talked about the courts and the laws intersecting. The legislature, even though we have jurisdiction under public trust responsibility, has definitely determined that there's activities that may or may not need a permit for the state to actually act on that responsibility. So just because it's green, it just means it's under state's responsibility of public trust. It doesn't necessarily mean you got to necessarily need a permit. The second part to that is we talked about navigable waters. And so we talked about how to determine if something's navigable, but we didn't talk about how to determine where that navigability ends when you're talking about moving up the bank. And so sometimes activities that are done in or near navigable waters are actually not in the water, and they may not need a permit because they're done above what we call the ordinary high water mark. And I'm going to get in a little bit about what that is right now. So obviously early on in the history of determining the state's jurisdiction over these public waters, there was a court case in 1914, this is pretty much the landmark court case, Diana Shooting Club, that basically talked about where the state's jurisdiction actually begins and ends when you're talking about navigable waters. And so what they coined was the ordinary high water mark. And what that is the point on the bank or shore to which the presence and action of water is so continuous as to leave a distinct mark by erosion, destruction of vegetation, or other easily recognized characteristic. So it's very clear as to what that is, right? I kind of say that with a smirk because sometimes in different water bodies and different systems, especially when you're talking about a difference between a lake or a river or Lake Michigan or Lake Geneva, it's very hard to sometimes determine where that mark is. But nonetheless, that's what we're tasked with doing because we need to determine where our jurisdiction is. And so some of the ways we do it is we look at biological indicators, like, as we said, a mark on the vegetation in the soils. So here's an example of a picture where if you look in the foreground, you can kind of see a little bit of white foam. On the left part of the screen, you can see a tiny part of the wood dock. And then below the arrow, you see sort of, it looks like sticks and things accumulated. That's sort of washed up debris, so that's still water. But where the arrow is pointing is right up on the bank, and you can see sort of the change where it's been eroded away, and then you have larger vegetation starting to grow near the top of that little lip area. And so, you know, that area where the water has perpetuated enough to leave a distinct mark or some other characteristic, you can see that change of vegetation. And so the ordinary high water mark would be sort of, it looks like, according to this picture, maybe, you know, 6 to 8 inches above the current water level. Same as in this picture, this is a little blurry, but you can still see where some of the erosion has occurred on the bank, where it's sort of like darker brownish color versus that nice green lush vegetation. You can kind of see that line traveling from the background towards the foreground of the photo. And so that's a good indicator of that distinct mark or line caused by perpetuation of the water being there long enough to make that change. That one's not so good to see. Sometimes you might not have vegetation, especially in river systems or things like that. So we can also use a combination of the physical indicators, which can be more erosive stains or water stains, things like that, exposed roots. You can see here on this rock, you can see the water level is clearly below sort of some of the staining that's on the rock, so that can help get a gauge as to where the ordinary high water mark is. Sometimes you can use bridge pilings or abutments, something that has been there for a really long time, to being able to get these sort of long-term marks. You know, rocks, I showed an example of the rock, but rocks move, especially in river systems. So, you know, rocks on the shore of a lake is one thing, but rocks in a river might not be so good. But something like a bridge where you know it's been there for a really, really long time, it really can help get an elevation as to where that ordinary high water mark is. And then, of course, you can see exposed roots or river or lake systems where you know, tree roots, and you can see that the water has perpetuated there long enough to not allow anything to grow. You can also see the marks on the roots as well. So just exposed roots and the way the roots are growing is a good sign of where that ordinary high water mark is, but then actually looking closer at the roots that we know have been there a long time, you can see some staining and some marks and help get an elevation that way. But again, you know, it's really sometimes hard to tell this. I showed a couple of pretty easy photos, but we have our water management specialists out in the field that can help with the navigability determinations as well as where these ordinary high water mark elevations are. We don't have the ordinary high water mark on the surface water data viewer yet. That's something we're actively working on. We're just trying to figure out exactly how to present the data, because sometimes we have it as, you know, number of inches above a certain water level or an elevation or something like that. So, but here's the web address to how to find out who the water management specialist is in your particular area that you work with. I'm hoping that most of you guys out there know who your water management specialist is and have already been working with them. But we do have turnover in our staff, so we may have a new person that maybe just hasn't had a time to work with you or introduce themselves to you yet. So feel free to use this address to look them up and make contact, because we should be working together. One other thing I'm going to say before we move off ordinary high water mark is that aside from determining where the state's jurisdiction is for public water, it's also where zoning setbacks are determined from. So it's pretty important to know where that is, especially when it comes to zoning. And sometimes a lot of projects may involve placing structures in the shoreline zone as well, where you need to know where those setbacks are. So something else to keep in mind when we're dealing with ordinary high water marks. So back to the question then. Now we're definitive as something that meets the navigability test, and there's also, we know where the ordinary high water mark is, and we know that our project or what we want to do is going to be below the ordinary high water mark, and it's in a water body that meets that navigability test. So I alluded to earlier about, do you always need a permit? And I mentioned that there's certain activities that the legislature has determined that doesn't need a permit, even though it still may impact the public's interest, or I should say is in the state's jurisdiction because it's on a navigable water and below the ordinary high water mark. But just because there's an exemption that the legislature has determined in statute, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's no regulation. It just means that to meet the state's responsibility, we're not going to be issuing a permit through the normal permit process. What it does mean is that there's still project standards. So when you guys are out there doing work and you're wondering, I wonder if this is a navigable water, or I wonder if this is a public water, I wonder, if you're going to need authorization, once you get past the navigability and the ordinary high water mark part, you can come here to this web address and look up the type of activity you're looking to do, and it'll give you basically information as to how you can do it without needing to go through the permit process. So these are what we call permit exemptions. You're exempt from a permit, but you're still under the state's jurisdiction. So that's why there's project standards that still apply. And so on this web page, there's sort of this quick start guide that sort of steps through some questions and basically tells you if you need a permit or not. And I have here in green, the state does have the responsibility that even though you may meet some of those or all of the requirements to not need a permit, if there's something that we didn't know or more information came out that for that particular site there could be a significant impact to a public interest. We're talking about fish and wildlife habitat, water quality, navigation, and those things we mentioned earlier, we could still require you to go through the permit process. So it doesn't necessarily mean you wouldn't be able to do the project. It just means that you wouldn't have the luxury of being exempt, and you'd have to go through the permit process, and we can make sure that the project is done in a way to meet the public interest responsibility. So I'm going to go through one of the biggest exemptions that we have right now for the Chapter 30 program, and that's related to agricultural activities. Obviously, Wisconsin has a long tradition of agriculture, and so early on when they were creating those laws and statutes, they basically put information or laws in the books that allowed agricultural activities to persist and not have to go through the permit process. So I'm going to outline some of these exemptions right now. So it's kind of clear, kind of a quick overview of some of the things that that you wouldn't have to go through the permit process, even though you would do the navigability test and you can clearly find an ordinary high water mark. So what is essentially agriculture when we're talking about what these agricultural exemptions are? Well, when we talk about agricultural in terms of public trust responsibility, 30.40 specifically tells us what that is in the statutes. And so that's your typical grazing, livestock, poultry, feedlot that we can particularly always think of. There's always beekeeping and floriculture. Sod farming's thrown in there because that's a big industry, or it may have been at one point. And then we have our other type of food growing activities. So all these types of things are considered to be agriculture. So if you are dealing with a landowner who's a farmer and they deal with any of these types of activities, they're going to be considered an agriculture sector, so to speak, under the state statutes in their Chapter 30. So with a lot of the agriculture comes, farm drainage ditches, and that's where we get into more of the activities related to our jurisdiction. So farm drainage ditches are outlined in 30.10 of the statutes. And so what this says it's basically has to be an artificial channel that drains water for agricultural purposes. And those agricultural purposes are directly related to that long list I just showed. So if you're, for instance, a sod farmer and you needed to have an artificial channel that needed to drain water for the purposes of having your sod farm, well, you would be considered an agricultural drainage ditch. Because of the importance of agricultural in the state, in that 30.10, it specifically says that if you're considered a farm drainage ditch, which means you're an artificial channel that drains water for agricultural purposes, you're not, that water body is not going to be navigable, which means there's no jurisdiction under the state. So you can imagine a situation where you're saying, wait a second, Marty Griffin of the DNR told me if I can float the lightest watercraft on a recurring basis and it has bed and banks and I found an ordinary high water mark that well, in this particular case, this is the part where the laws are interpreting the Northwest Ordinance, right, or the Constitution. If it meets these two check marks, doesn't matter if you can float a boat, doesn't matter, there's an ordinary high water mark. It's an artificial channel meant to drain water for agricultural purposes. But there is one kick out for that particular farm drainage ditch, and that is if somehow that particular farm drainage ditch was navigable before it was ditched, before it was an artificial created channel, then the state may have, or does have jurisdiction. So farm drainage ditches can be a little confusing, but that's okay. This is a quick overview. But basically what it's saying is today in 2015, if it's an artificial channel and drains water for agricultural purposes, doesn't matter if you can float your watercraft, but if before it became an artificial channel, before it became a ditch for those agricultural purposes, if somebody could have floated a watercraft back then it still holds true today, even though it was altered. So for these particular farm drainage ditches, the navigability test is more difficult. We have to rely more on stream history than we do actually physically being able to float the craft and looking for ordinary high water marks. We do that by looking at a variety of historic records that anyone can go look up and look for themselves. And it helps us sort of piece together if the particular water body in question was navigable before it was straightened and ditched and became a farm drainage ditch. So that's one of the largest exemptions we have for agriculture, is that if it's considered the water body considered a farm drainage ditch, there's no state jurisdiction. And I guarantee you'll see farm drainage ditches on USGS topo maps. They've been there for a long time. You'll see it on the surface water data viewer. You'll see a blue straight line. That's a farm drainage ditch. And it looks like it's blue, it looks like we have jurisdiction, but if it meets those criteria, and it did not have history, stream history before it was created, even though it may connect with a bunch of other different waterways that we do have jurisdiction over, we wouldn't in those cases. Some other things related to agricultural activities that may not be a farm drainage ditch creation also have some exemptions that the legislature have created. And again, when we're talking about agricultural activities, we're talking about that whole list of agricultural uses. For example, if you were a nut farmer and you needed to use the waterway for some of your nut tree propagation. So you would not need a water permit if you're doing agricultural activities. If you're a cranberry grower, there's a specific part as for cranberries, you don't need a Chapter 30 or a public waterway permit, which means you can create a drainage ditch or water diversions, and if it's for cranberry operations, you're good to go, and also water withdrawals. These are the three most common activities we see with cranberry operations, and these are the three most common activities that may affect public waters, and so these are the three most activities that mostly we see people wanting to do, and if it's for cranberry operations, they can go ahead and do it, and they don't need to go through the permit process. There's other activities that may not be related to cranberries. I talked about, the nut tree farmer or whatnot. Grading on the bank. A lot of earth moving activity on the bank. I know sometimes moving earth can be used as an erosion control activity to slope back the bank and allow that water to not cut into the bank as much. If it's for agricultural activities, you can go ahead and do that without any department permit process. If you're creating a connected enlargement, which basically means dredging out an area, widening an area on a stream to have a little enlarged area, those again fall into that not needing a permit category. Sometimes for agricultural purposes, you see ponds that are created within 500 feet. Either they're watering ponds or irrigation ponds, different uses of the ponds. If it's for agricultural activity, you would not need to go through the department permit process. Dredging is a little more complicated, but a certain particular type of dredging you would not need to go through the permit process, and so that would be if it was a farm drainage ditch, and we talked about what that was. It has to drain irrigational lands and be artificially created. If you're dredging one of those things and it doesn't have stream history like we talked about, then you can go ahead and clean it out as much as you want without needing to go through the permit process. There is one caveat to dredging activities if you're going to be cleaning out farm drainage ditches that you should know about. And that's, we talked about if the exemption activity was going to have a significant impact that we could require a permit for it. Well, this is a similar thing. If cleaning out that ditch, now remember, these are farm drainage ditches. So these are things that are legislatively put in the statutes as not needing a permit. Remember, you could still float it in 2015, but if there was no stream history when it was built, you couldn't float it back then. It just became that way over time because of what was man-made on the landscape. And even though we have particular fisheries that like to use those ditches, we wouldn't need any department permit to do those other activities I showed. But if you're dredging, if you're cleaning out, and you did have an effect on these cold water fisheries, we could require a permit for those. So the one thing to think about is if you're dealing with a farm drainage ditch, if you want to clean it out, you want to dredge it, the first call is to the fisheries biologist, or you can call our water management specialists in the field. They'll make that call. It's a 2-second call. A lot of our water management specialists, or even you people out here listening in the audience right now, may have expertise in fisheries and know your resource and know that no fish ever use these. But there's other areas in the state, or maybe you're familiar with, that farm drainage ditches are probably one of the preferred uses, or one of the uses that fish use to run up and spawn because all their natural stream channels have been altered into these drainage ditches. One particular area in the state I can think about is the northeast part of the state, where you have your northern pike that use a lot of these ditches. So for dredging, that's one thing that even though you're able to do without getting a permit through the permit process, if there's going to be an effect on some of these fisheries, spawning areas or nursery areas, we can require a permit to make sure that some of those activities are done at special times of the year where you will not have as much as an effect. So as we're segueing in from the agricultural exemptions to other activities that may not be particularly related to agricultural, if you're withdrawing water or diverting water and it's for agricultural use, these are some of the activities where you do need a permit. Now remember, don't get confused. If your cranberry operation, which is agriculture, you don't. So that's the only sort of agricultural entity on that long list of agricultural activities I showed earlier. That's the only one that would not need a permit for these activities. But any other type of farmer that's not a cranberry farmer is going to need a permit for water withdrawals, water diversions, and if the land gets sold and changes from a farming operation to something different. But if he's a farmer and he's not doing these three things up on the screen, all those other things I listed, grading on the bank, dredging, those things you don't need a permit for. So it can be confusing, I understand, and that's what the water management specialists are for. That's what I'm here for, to help you out. But this is basically just here to illustrate that there are activities that can be done in these public waters that don't necessarily need authorization, but there are others that do. Especially those related to a non-agricultural use, so if your client is not a farmer, or a non-agricultural purpose. So you could have land in agricultural production, agricultural use, but the activity that they want to do has no purpose for agriculture. An example of a non-agricultural purpose would be, putting in a culvert to cross a waterway to get to the living quarters or the house, and it's just access to the farm field, but not needed for actually any farming operations, because all the other farming is done on a different part of the property. So you have agricultural use as your activity, but this purpose of this culvert is just to get to your house, not to get to anything related to farming. So that's where we get into the purpose part of it. So for these non-agricultural use and non-agricultural purpose, so these are activities that aren't going to fall under those agricultural exemptions we're talking about. Some of the common activities you're going to find, and they're all listed in state statutes of Chapter 30. And we also have administrative codes, and that's the NR 300 series. And that just means all of our administrative codes that have a number that starts with 300, I think it's between 300 and 400, are administrative codes that are mostly related to Chapter 30 of the state statutes. And administrative codes have the same force of law. They're basically the same as a statute, except that they're not written and going through the statute creation process, but they go through the administrative code process, which has legislative oversight, but can be done by the particular departments, like the Department of Natural Resources, for instance. And they interpret and clarify and add more information to what the statutes actually say. So within our statutes and within our codes, we talked a little bit about the beginnings of our three-tier system, and we talked a lot about the agricultural exemptions. If you don't fall into one of those agricultural exemptions, for instance, if it's not agricultural use, or you may not fall under the exemption for some other reason, there are general permits and individual permits. And so that makes up the other two parts of our three-tiered system that we use as a regulatory framework to protect the public interest in public waters. So we talked about an exemption was. An exemption was you meet the standards and you don't need to go through any permit process. General permits are a little bit differently. They again have these predetermined standards, sort of like a cookbook recipe. You pick your activity off the shelf, you open up the cookbook, and it tells you how you should design it, and if you can meet that recipe, you basically get your permit. And you get your decision in 30 days or less. So it's a fast, streamlined process. And we encourage everybody doing projects where they know they're going to need a permit, they don't fall under any exemption, to try and see if your project can fit one of our general permits first, because it's a fast, easy way to get authorization in public waters, and then you can go ahead and get doing what you need to do. But we recognize that not everything's going to meet a cookie-cutter standard recipe for placing a structure or altering public waters in some other way. So we do have what we call our individual permit process, and it's a little longer process because we have to review all the standards instead of using our cookbook predetermined recipe, but it's customized, and so it can fit the project that you have in mind and the project that you need to do, to meet whatever purpose and need that you're going for. The reason why it takes a little longer than 30 days to get our individual permits is, in addition to the increased review time, the legislature has said that there needs to be a mandatory public notice and some other mandatory timeline requirements, which bumps up the minimum or the fastest you could ever get an individual permit just because of the mandatory timelines and notices is 105 days. So, you're looking at somewhere of over 3 months to get a permit, and that's if everything goes the fastest just because of the mandatory timelines that the legislature put into the permit process. And that's because these individual permits are really meant for either larger projects that don't fit our general permits or projects that are more detailed and need more review to make sure that the public interest test is going to be met. So if you're ever wondering about, well, 105 days, well, what are those mandatory things? Why can't it be 60, 90? We do have our permit processes laid out for everyone to see on our website, and so if you go to our main Waterways website, which is shown up here on the screen, and there's a Learn button, you can get to our permit process and timelines that can kind of show you exactly, what the mandatory amount of time that the department has to do a certain step, and also the mandatory amount of time that the department has to, wait or utilize for certain steps. And so it can kind of give you an idea if you're doing a project timing and you're sort of checking to see how far in advance you need to actually apply for your permit to see how long it might take to get your permit, and then add on to your, how long it takes for the project. This is a good, resource to use, sort of plan out the timing for the project. We also have on our website that we like to point out is because we have so many different general permits, we have, a lot of cookbooks available on the shelf. It's sometimes hard to know exactly if your project's going to fit one of those. And so we have on all of our different project or different activity types on our website, which is listed at the bottom, we have these decision modules that you can answer a series of questions and answers, and it basically tells you exactly which general permits you could meet and be eligible for. So essentially it asks you some questions. It asks you some questions related to, using that cookbook analogy again, some of the ingredients or type of style that you want your final product to come out as, and it sort of fits those and says, okay, well, since you want to do that, you definitely can fit under our general permit if you meet a few other things, or wait a second, you want to do that, well, maybe an individual permit is the route you want to go. And this is a nice tool because it quickly lets you plan ahead, and you can start clicking through, and it says, wait a second, it says I need an individual permit. Well, Marty Griffin from DNR says that takes 105 days at the fastest, and there's no way I can take that much time. But you can go back through the questions and say, well, what if I modify this here, modify that there, and I can get to a general permit. So this is a way to help you use your project and some of the standards to get yourself to that general permit to get that faster, streamlined process. We also have the ability to apply for those permits online. So once you go through that question and answer module, and once you determine if that general permit is actually going to work for you, we have the ability to apply for everything online right now. So if you go to this website here shown at the bottom, and you look for the Waterway and Wetland tab, you can find the activity. For instance, it was grading on the bank or dredging. You find your topic and you just click Begin General Permit or Individual Permit, just because hopefully you've determined which one of those works best for your project. And you can go ahead and fill out our application form, pay your fee for the permit application, and get entered into our electronic permitting system right away. So that cuts down on some of the timing and timelines, especially if you're thinking of doing a general permit where we have a mandatory 30-day review time. And if you apply electronically for general permit, it essentially comes to us instantly, gets to the permit reviewer, within 24, 48 hours of when you hit that submit button, and that 30-day clock is beginning. So another way to quickly get permits and make things easy. One thing I should mention, because I've been using grading as an example a lot, and I know that a lot of you guys deal with projects that deal with grading, especially using grading, sloping back banks and stuff as a form of erosion control. There has been some changes in the law, so in our Q&A, or if you actually went on our website and went through the questions, it would get you to this answer. But I do need to mention that if you have a project that impacts more than 1 acre of land, which means it needs a state stormwater permit, or if you're already going to be required to have a county grading permit, then you don't even need to come to the state to grade on the banks. So that's something that I think people should know about. But there are situations, for instance, a municipality like a city who has a project, or someone who has a project in city limits, so there's no county grading or jurisdiction, and they have less than 1 acre, so they could be dealing with not having to get a stormwater permit. So that's a situation where you'd still need a state Chapter 30 grading permit, obviously if it was over 10,000 square feet, which is our minimum threshold for jurisdiction. So for the last part of this talk, I'm going to go through some more examples of some of the more common activities that I know some of you guys are involved with, and sort of step through some of the general permit standards a little bit to see if any of your projects could meet these or be modified to meet them. Sort of just give you an example of what you'd be seeing if you went through our question and answer, or if you looked at some of our materials online to determine if you're eligible for a general permit or not. So just to give you an idea of some of the types of standards that you'll see to try to make your projects go through this streamlined process. So stream erosion control work, I know that be for a lot of people out there. And so there's two particular general permits, but in all instances, all the standards are listed in NR 328, so that's another administrative code reference. You can go right to that code because that's where the general permit standards are listed. Obviously, if you go on our website and use our tools, we have, fact sheets and checklists already created that pulls that information from the code for you. But if you ever wanted to go back and look at the exact legal language that requires certain standards, that's where you would find it. And for our stream bank erosion control general permits, the availability is based on the location of where the project is. So if you're in the driftless area, which is the lighter tannish color in the western part of the state, or the southeastern till plains, which is that orangish to the southeastern part of the state, if you're in those areas, there's automatically going to pretty much be a general permit for stream bank erosion available to you. If you're in any other part of the state and you're within an urban watershed or in a village or city, which on this map I think is indicated, or at least the urban watersheds are indicated by some gray cross-hatching, you would have a general permit available to you. So, in this particular case, stream bank erosion control has a location component to it where these cookie cutter off-the-shelf meet the standard projects are only available in certain areas. That's definitely not the case with all of our general permits, just in this particular example I'm showing. For all of our general permits, there's going to be a construction window to protect fish spawning. And a construction window basically means that there are certain dates where you're not able to do the project because of fish spawning activities. So, keep in mind that's something that's going to have to be factored into for all projects that want to be eligible for a general permit, there's going to be these fish kickout dates. We realize as well that there are projects that just maybe have to happen in those times or can't avoid some of those fish windows, and that's okay, because in all of our general permits we do offer the ability to get a waiver from the fisheries biologist. So essentially, when you apply for a general permit, knowing that your construction window is in these dates, you basically request to the water management specialist to talk with the fish biologist and see that if there's anything you can do to mitigate or change your project outside of changing the project dates to help protect the fish spawning. Or it might be an area that doesn't even have much spawning and the fisheries biologist has that data and information, and they can provide you a waiver. So it's not a deal breaker, but it's something we do like people to plan for ahead when they're going for these cookie cutter general permits. The other part that's important for general permits is endangered and threatened species. That's a requirement for all of our permits that we issue, whether it's a general permit or individual permit. I know a lot of times, sometimes that's something that people don't think about, and then they learn about these requirements later and they have to completely redesign their project to help mitigate these types of species. The cool thing about this is that the Endangered Resources Program is sort of becoming more flexible in the way they look at these, and they do have a self-certification process for certain projects. So we really recommend that you go to this website here that's listed and you do this process that helps you basically get a piece of paper from them that you can print out saying that because you use certain construction techniques or certain things that you're not going to impact the species of question in your area. And if you submit that along with any permit application, that'll just make the permit process go that much faster, because that's a review we don't have to do by the reviewer internally that you've already done externally for us. A couple other things that are basically always a part of these general permits that you can use to make sure you can design your projects the right way is we're always going to be dealing with the erosion control BMP, so I know that's a standard thing, but I always like to mention it, and wetlands. Obviously, there's going to be another webinar talking specifically about our wetland jurisdiction and our wetland laws, and that's because they are different and they are separate. There's no like joint Chapter 30 and wetland jurisdiction. They're two separate bodies of law with two separate histories and two separate jurisdictions. So if you do have a project that's going to impact wetlands, you're going to have to deal with the Chapter 30 permitting side and also with the wetland side. So when we're talking about these cookie cutter general permits that are off the shelf, none of them are going to allow activities in wetlands, because you're going to negate your speed and streamlining if you have to go through a whole separate permit process to get your project approved. So the two types of activities for stream making erosion control that we have general permits for are biostabilization and integrated bank treatment, and there's specific standards for each of these types of activities, and I'm not going to go through them all, but I'm just going to show up here on the screen just sort of an example of some of the things that you have to meet. And this will help you sort of, if you go on our website and go online and get these sort of checklists and get this information, it'll help you make sure you design your projects in the right way. Another activity that I know many of you deal with is stream crossings. You can cross a stream in many different ways. You know, you could use a ford, a culvert, or a bridge, or even a clear span bridge. And so we have specific general permits available for those as well. And we encourage everyone to try to create projects that meet those requirements. And I put up the administrative code references as well on here for each of these different water crossing activities. And you'll notice there are two separate administrative codes. One is NR 329 and the other is NR 320. So NR 320 deals with our culverts and bridges, and then NR 329 deals with fords. Again, with a lot of our general permits, and you learn with the stream making erosion control general permits, location is important, and that does hold true for stream crossing permits as well. We do have what we call special designated waters, and some of you may have heard of them. One is called an ASNRI, or an area of special natural resource interest. For example, those are our trout streams in the state. There's some other listings that go under that ASNRI. We also have PRFs, or what we call public rights features, and you may have heard of those as sensitive areas and things like that. So for general permits, especially for waterway crossings, the culvert or a bridge, if you are in an area of special natural resource interest, like a trout stream or something, you're good to go getting a general permit for a bridge or a culvert. That's not going to be something that's going to hinder that, even though it's a special designated water. And that's, again, because we have these cookie cutter, recipes, the way you do these projects, and if you do them correctly, we're going to say you're going to meet that public interest responsibility. I have in parentheses here, forage only available if they're agricultural use. So that basically means if you want to get a general permit for a ford and it's in a trout stream or one of these areas of special natural resource interest, if it's agricultural use, we'll allow a ford in some of those special designated waters. But if it's not agricultural use and someone wants to put in a ford and it is one of these designated waters, you would not be able to get a ford permit. But bridge culvert should be good to go. Public rights features, you won't be able to get many of our general permits if you're going to place in an area that's considered a sensitive area public rights feature. Clear span bridges are okay, but most other waterway crossings are not. If you're trying to figure out, well, wow, how do I know if I'm in one of these, ASNRI or PRFs, I want to make sure I'm eligible for this general permit, just go to that surface water data view I talked about before, Google SWDV. And instead of touching on that layer that talked about navigability, you just turn on the layer that says designated waters. And it will list these in different colors, and you'll be able to tell where your project is located if it's one of these designated waters. And you'll know very quickly if you could get a general permit in your area or not. Again, there are some additional standards for waterway crossings that if you want to use the cookie cutter recipe, you should have to meet. We have limits on how much approach fill, so how much fill you're putting in the approach on the approach road coming up to your crossing. Obviously, we talked about sediment control before. The fish spawning we talked about as well. And flood maintenance, a lot of waterway crossings, they're meant to overtop or not meant to overtop. And they do need maintenance to make sure they work the way they're supposed to work, especially when we're talking about keeping with the standards that it was originally built for in the cookie cutter recipe. So that's something to be aware of if you have a waterway crossing situation. We do require maintenance. So wrapping up here, I just wanted to give some people out there a little bit of idea of, okay, well, I know you have jurisdiction, I know I need a permit, and I know I'd love to get a general permit. Maybe I have to get an individual permit. Will I even get it? And so here's a little bit of information just to show you that we pretty much give a lot of permits out. This is just, the comparison between 2013 and 2014, but really what you're looking at is that first bar, which is our approved bar. And the GPs are in blue and the individual permits, IPs, are in red. And so going from left to right, you have the approved, the denied, withdrawn, and no decision. No decision basically means that it hasn't been approved or denied, and withdrawn means that the applicant decided they didn't want to do the project anymore, so they just stopped the permit process and pulled their application. So we have a lot of permits we approve for general permits. I mean, that's why we steer people toward those. If you meet that cookie cutter recipe, you're going to get it. When it comes to individual permits, we approve them all. I mean, you look at how many are denied. If you look at the second column, it's pretty much flat. We very rarely deny them because when you're going through an individual permit process, it's longer, but it gives us more time to work with you to get a project that we know can meet the public interest. So, the take-home message is, even though we may have jurisdiction, and we went through the whole history of that, that's the facts and that's the way it is. Even though you have to go through the permit process because of that jurisdiction, it doesn't necessarily mean the project doesn't need to go forward. It just means you need to plan ahead to account for the time it takes to make sure we're meeting that public interest. But if we do that upfront work and do that time, you can see very clearly here, you're going to get approval for the project. So that's all I had to talk about, and I left plenty of time for questions. So I guess at this time, we can just open it up. I don't know, Christina, is there a way for people to verbally ask, or is it all going to be through the chat, or how do you want to work it?
Yeah, no, that's no problem. If you have a microphone and would like to ask a question, find your name on the attendee list or up in the top. Just unclick that so it turns green, and you'll be unmuted. If you don't have a microphone, feel free to just put it in the chat and make sure that under the 2 it says everyone so we can all see the question. So yeah, feel free to ask Marty any burning questions. I don't know if Brian, if you're, oh, looks like we do have a question from Kelly. Marty, can you see that? County grading permits exempt projects
yes.
from Chapter 30. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, so basically what I was saying there was that if the county issues grading permits, and usually counties issue grading permits through their shoreline zoning program, if it's a grading where we normally would have jurisdiction, that is, next to a public waterway. Obviously, you can do grading, anywhere, like in an upland area or something, which we wouldn't have jurisdiction over anyway. But for these activities that are grading near waterways or on the banks of waterways, counties usually can issue permits through their shoreline zoning program. And if that's the case, if they can do that, and it's typically in a town, if they can do that, then you would not need a Chapter 30 permit for grading. But typically in cities and villages, there isn't shoreline zoning jurisdiction, so there isn't shoreline zoning. So in that case, you may not have the opportunity for a county grading permit, and so Chapter 30 may have jurisdiction there to require a permit.
All right, there's a question from Greene County. Could you review where to find the maps for stream history?
Yes, maps for stream history. Let me find that, because there's a good list. All right. So here's the list of the stream history maps. So where to find them, I actually didn't put it on here. I realized they're all housed at the UW Historical Library, or UW, I think it's called Library Archives or something like that, and that's where you can get these electronically. So if you just type in like UW-Madison government survey or Bordner survey, that's the guy who did it back then, B-O-R-D-N-E-R, you'll get the website to get these. The USGS topo maps, I provided a link earlier on a different slide. But you type in USGS topo maps, you can get that. So you can get to where those are, and they do go back in the old ones as well. The land economic inventory, I'm not quite sure where you get those. And then the aerial photos, again, the UW Historical Archives has old aerial photos, but also many counties I know have some old aerial photos. Our DNR website, if you go on the surface water data viewer again and look at the layer related to the ortho photo layer, we do have old aerial photos. So those where you can find old aerials.
I can send a few links out in the upcoming sitcom newsletter that maybe have some of the links that Marty's talked about in this.
Oh, good. And I can give those to you, Christina.
That'd be great.
Too, because I do have a list. I just didn't list it here.
Sure, no problem. Paul Backus is asking, if you don't get a response to a general application permit in 30 days, is it automatically approved?
Good question. Yes, I also did mention that. This is great. Yeah, that is true. For a general permit, it is presumptive approval, which means that If we don't get an answer to you in 30 days, it's considered to be presumptively approved and you can go ahead and do the activity. But that doesn't mean that all the general permit standards just get erased. You still have to do the activity according to the standards because that's what you applied under. It just means that you didn't have a signed piece of paper from the state authorizing that your plants actually meet those general permit standards. So short answer is yes, and then that was the long answer.
All right. So Lisa Schultz is asking, can you give an example of when no decision was made for a permit and why, referring to the category on the bar graph you referenced earlier?
Yes, so the no decision actually means that there's been no decision, which means that it's been approved. We haven't said it's been denied. And the reason why some of those are in there is because when I pulled the data from a database, I just pulled all permits, and either we were in the middle of the permit process, so a decision wasn't entered yet, and sometimes longer projects linger in different parts of the permit process longer than others. Sometimes we get projects in, we put into the database, and there's errors. So it could either be an error or it could be one that we haven't issued yet because we're in the middle of the permit process, and it could be another project that's in a really longer permit process. Hopefully that answers the question.
Great. Another Lisa asked, once a permit is issued, for example, rock riprap, can you comment on the difference between maintenance of the structure or when a repair or replacement of a general permit would be required?
Yeah, very good. These are great questions. So for rock riprap, if it's a general permit, so if you want to get a repair or replacement general permit, the way we distinguish, because we actually have two separate general permits, one called repair of rock riprap and one called for replacement, different standards. The way we distinguish between those two general permits to pick which one you fall under is if you're going all the way down to like the filter fabric and you're ripping everything out and you're going down, you're putting new base material plus your filter fabric, we're considering that complete replacement. If you're sort of ripping everything out but you're going to keep the filter fabric in place, just putting new rock on, or even if it's a less of a repair where you're putting new rock, you know, just putting it, replacing, not replacing new, but I'm saying a rock that has shifted or moved that you're putting back into place, that's going to be considered repair. So going down the filter fabric, base material, if you're ripping all that out and starting fresh, that's going to be replacement. If you're keeping that filter fabric, that base layer material in and just putting stuff on top, that's going to be considered repair.
Great.
And then if you're in an individual permit world, I can just say for individual permits, we don't really have that distinguished. We don't need to because there's no separate permit. So if you get an individual permit and you have to do repair maintenance on your rock riprap, you can do whatever you want as long as you stay within the original permit conditions of size, type of rock, and things like that.
Great. Dane County asked, if a point on a stream is determined not navigable, is everything above that point also not navigable up in the stream?
Good question. The answer is yes and no. So it kind of depends. If you pick a point in a stream and it's non-navigable, and you're like, okay, it's non-navigable, is everything upstream considered non-navigable? Chances are yes, because you don't really have situations in the landscape where you go non-navigable, navigable, non-navigable, but there are cases where it could. So I'm saying yes and no because we may presume for a certain amount of time or distance that we can see or that we sort of know and look at on a map that, yeah, it's probably not navigable. You make it to a different area and say, wait a second, we need to go check this point. So I don't think you can make that assumption, but you can use that as a starting point if you want to make decisions based on it. But I guess that's a pretty vague answer because it's hard to know without going on site or seeing a map or knowing the landscape, the watershed size, and all these different things that we factor into. So I guess it's not a rule of thumb, but for some instances I think it could hold true.
Great. Ralph Helmley was asking, is 500 feet still a determination between a general permit and an individual permit?
I think this question is referring to stream bank erosion control. If that's the case, the distance your treatment can be. And if that's the case, yes, it still is. Let me see if I can find it. I had a little graphic that can verify that. Yes, that's correct. So for integrated bank treatment, for general permits for stream bank erosion control, when you're using integrated bank treatment as your project type, it is limited for the general permit up to 500 feet. That 500 feet can be broken up into smaller chunks, but if you do that, you're limited to then a quarter mile of stream. So you could do 500 all in one. You can break it up into 5 different segments of 100 as long as it's within a quarter mile stream. If you have projects that need to be longer or incorporate more, that's going to push you into an individual permit.
Okay. So Faye is asking in regards to the Chapter 30 grading exemption only applies if county CSE ordinance adopted under 59.692. Is that correct? Walworth County has CSENSWM ordinance was adopted under this 59.693. So exemption not applicable in Walworth County based on a memo from the DNR in 2012. It's kind of a long one, so if you can see it. But
that's a great question, and that answer is yes. That's absolutely correct. So that typed out, that comment is 100% correct, and I didn't go into all those details, but that's 100% correct. There's 2 ways you can adopt shoreline zoning ordinances and authorities, and the way they wrote the exemption for grading in the law was only a reference one of them and not both, or reference not the overriding one. So yes, that little nuance is in there. And I'm glad you talked about the memo, because we did do an analysis and looked at which counties fell under this, little nuance and which didn't. And so we do have a listing of counties where the grading exemption applies or wouldn't apply. So I can get those to people, because it's not like it's a big secret. But our staff in the field, our water management specialists, do have that information. So you can also contact them if you're questioning whether you'd be covered under the grading exemption or not.
Great. Kelly said, thank you for clarification on the grading exemption permits. I do have a follow-up question. This might be actually the same. Does the county construction site erosion control permit and county stormwater management permit constitute grading permit and thus exempt? So I think this is the similar question maybe. These permitted sites can be located in and on shoreland areas of navigable waters.
Yes, the answer to that question is yes. So if you have a county stormwater management permit, because I understand that counties can enter into this agreement, 216 agreement. So if it's under 216, that's correct, because it's 216 is the state stormwater authority, and it does say if you have a state stormwater permit, but these counties and municipalities that are in this program, that does count. We determine that. So the answer is yes.
Great. Are there any other questions? And again, feel free to unmute yourself if you would like. Paul Backus asked, best way to get a quick response to a question within 1 or 2 days?
Yeah, wow, summer season's tough. So if you can't get an answer to your question online, because we really put a lot of effort in those question and answer step through things, water management specialists for the county you work with is your first direct line of contact. But 1 to 2 days, especially the summer field season, could be challenging. I would say a quick response is like 3 to 4 days. But you could contact them through email and voicemail. Now, if for some reason you're not getting a quick response, it's definitely okay to go to our regional field staff, go to their supervisor, and ask the supervisor the question, or I really need an answer, I'm not getting an answer. And everybody in the world knows who everybody's supervisor is, because on our department website, dnr.wi.gov, if you go to our contact list and type in the name of your water management specialist, you can find the email and phone number of their supervisor. It's very easy. So I would say that's the way I would proceed. You can always call me. We have 2 other policy staff in Madison, myself, Cammie Peterson, who's going to be doing the wetland webinar, and Heidi Kennedy, and we all are really knowledgeable about the program, so I'll offer up our contact information as well. If you need a quick answer and you're not able to reach a water management specialist in the field, feel free to give one of us a call, and we can try to help you out as fast as we can as well.
Great. There's another question from Dane County. Can you further expand on an existing constructed grassed waterway conservation practice would be considered navigable?
All right, so if I understand the question, the grass waterway is already constructed because it's a conservation practice, and that we're trying to figure out if there's a situation where that already existing grass waterway could be considered navigable and require permits and things for work done to it. It's hard to say. Obviously, if you construct a grass waterway, you know, as part of connected to already navigable water, you know, we're going to have jurisdiction over that. If it was an old grass waterway that was constructed a long time ago, and it was part of an old stream where we could find stream history on that grass waterway, we could take jurisdiction. If the grass waterway is super, super old, like someone constructed it, and it was for, who knows, it's a conservation practice, so maybe it wasn't even for farming, or it was for farming at one point, but the land use changed, and it still existed, functioning as a grassed water, but there's no agricultural use anymore, and you know, it's never been maintained, and now it's getting defined bed and bank. You know, we could take jurisdiction over that because, you know, land use changed. They make it meet the navigability test, and there's no agricultural or drainage ditch protection. So I guess that's another situation where an old grass waterway could be considered navigable. I mean, if it's newly created and it's functioning, and it was created as a conservation practice under the agricultural exemption, I don't see how we would say it's navigable. That farm field gets sold, and that thing still drains water, and it doesn't get maintained, and it gets defined bed and banks, and it meets the navigability test, then it could be considered navigable. You know, so that's a really good example of something that, because of an exemption, isn't considered navigable under jurisdiction, but something changes, and all of a sudden it does become. So, you know, navigability can change over time in those examples. Hopefully that answers it.
Great. All right. I think that are all the questions. Anybody else? Last kind of chance to ask Marty a question. All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming. If you have any other questions, like Marty said, you know, try to look on the website. Would be your first point of contact, and your local DNR specialist would also be a great point of contact. And if otherwise, Marty or Cammie or Heidi would be someone that you could talk to as well. If you have any questions about training needs, please contact me, Christina Anderson at christina@wisconsinlandwater.org. As I had said, this training has been recorded, so I will post this to our website, as well as share the link to the archive video on our through our SITCOM newsletter. SITCOM is our state interagency training committee, and we work to try to put on these trainings. So if you have any training need, once again, please contact me and make sure that you're signed up for our newsletter. And then tune back in on July 23rd. Cammie will be with us to focus on the wetlands portion of Chapter 30, and we'll talk a little bit about wetlands. That will also be recorded. Thank you very much, and I hope to have you all on on the 23rd. Thank you, and thank you, Marty.